The man behind the legend, Churchill's greatest vulnerability and strength. David stared at the rejection email on his laptop screen, the third promotion he'd been passed over for in 2 years. At 34, he was technically brilliant, worked longer hours than anyone in his department, and had single-handedly saved the company millions through his innovations. Yet somehow he remained invisible to leadership, while colleagues with half his competence advanced effortlessly past him. What David didn't understand was that he was missing the same crucial element that nearly destroyed one of history's greatest leaders, and ultimately became Winston Churchill's secret weapon. The world knows Churchill as the indomitable bulldog who stood alone against Nazi Germany, the man whose words rallied a nation and whose iron will never bent under the most crushing pressure. But what history books rarely reveal is that this legendary figure of strength harbored a vulnerability so profound it nearly ended his career multiple times, and how one woman's influence transformed this weakness into the very foundation of his greatness. Churchill's hidden weakness wasn't alcohol, though he drank heavily. It wasn't his famous black dog depression, though it tormented him throughout his life. Churchill's greatest vulnerability was his desperate, almost pathological need for validation and approval from others. This was a man who could face down Hitler but crumbled at criticism from peers, who could inspire millions, but was paralyzed by self-doubt when alone. Have you ever felt like you accomplish incredible things, yet somehow never feel truly seen or appreciated for who you really are? The young Winston Churchill was brilliant but insufferable, a combination that made him simultaneously impressive and unlikable. He dominated conversations, name-dropped constantly, and had an almost compulsive need to be the smartest person in every room. His colleagues found him exhausting. His superiors saw him as unreliable despite his obvious talents. He was the person everyone acknowledged was gifted, but nobody wanted to work with closely. This pattern followed Churchill through his early political career like a curse. He would achieve remarkable successes: his escape from the Boer prison camp, his prescient warnings about German militarization, his naval innovations, but each triumph was overshadowed by his inability to build lasting alliances or inspire genuine loyalty. People respected his intellect, but questioned his judgment about human nature, including his own. David recognized this pattern in his own life with uncomfortable clarity. He was the co-worker who always had the right technical solution, but somehow never got invited to the important strategy meetings. He was brilliant in his field, but invisible when it came to leadership opportunities. Like Churchill, David had mistaken being impressive for being influential, knowledge for wisdom, competence for charisma. The transformation began when Churchill met Clementine Hozier in 1904, though he wouldn't fully understand its significance until years later. Clementine possessed something that Churchill both desperately needed and secretly feared: the ability to see through his performances to the insecure, validation-hungry man beneath and still choose to love and believe in him. But this wasn't the simple story of a good woman taming a difficult man. Clementine's influence on Churchill was far more sophisticated and profound than that. She didn't try to change his fundamental nature or suppress his ambitions. Instead, she became the mirror that showed him the difference between his authentic strengths and his compensating weaknesses. Churchill's marriage to Clementine in 1908 began what would become a 57-year masterclass in how the right partnership can transform not just personal happiness, but professional effectiveness. Clementine didn't manage Churchill by controlling him. She managed the relationship by becoming his most trusted advisor, his harshest critic, and his most unwavering supporter, often simultaneously. The genius of Clementine's approach was that she never attacked Churchill's ego directly. Instead, she taught him to channel his need for validation into service for causes larger than himself. When he was posturing for attention, she would redirect his focus to the people who truly needed his leadership. When he was spiraling into self-doubt, she would remind him of his unique capabilities and responsibilities. David began to understand that his own professional struggles weren't really about competence or recognition. They were about emotional intelligence and the ability to make others feel valued rather than threatened. Like Churchill, David had been so focused on proving his worth that he'd forgotten to demonstrate his value to others. Churchill's letters to Clementine reveal a man completely different from his public persona. In private correspondence, he was vulnerable, seeking guidance, admitting mistakes, and expressing genuine gratitude for her counsel. "You are my dearest and most beloved of human beings," he wrote during World War I, "and my greatest friend and wisest counselor." This wasn't weakness, it was the foundation of Churchill's later strength. Clementine had become his safe harbor, the one person with whom he could drop his defenses completely. This emotional safety allowed him to take enormous risks in his public life, because he knew he had one relationship that wasn't dependent on his success or failure. Can you think of a relationship in your life where you feel completely accepted for who you are, not what you accomplish? The true test of Clementine's influence came during Churchill's political wilderness years in the 1930s. After the Gallipoli disaster and several other career setbacks, Churchill found himself increasingly isolated from the Conservative Party establishment. His warnings about Hitler were dismissed as warmongering, his political judgment questioned, his future seemingly finished. During this period, Churchill's old patterns of desperate attention-seeking could have destroyed what remained of his reputation. Instead, Clementine helped him understand that his value lay not in being right about everything, but in being useful when it mattered most. She encouraged him to continue his warnings about Nazi Germany, not because it would rehabilitate his career, but because it was necessary regardless of personal cost. This shift from validation-seeking to purpose-driven behavior fundamentally changed how others perceived Churchill. Instead of the ambitious politician trying to restart his career, he became the lone voice willing to speak uncomfortable truths. This transformation in motivation made him authentic in a way he had never been before, and authenticity, even, when unpopular, creates a different kind of respect. David realized that his own career frustrations stemmed from a similar problem. He was so focused on getting credit for his contributions that he had forgotten to focus on making contributions that truly mattered to others. Like Churchill, he needed to shift from seeking validation to offering genuine value. When World War II finally vindicated Churchill's warnings and brought him to power as Prime Minister, Clementine's influence became even more crucial. The pressures of wartime leadership would have broken most men, but Churchill had spent decades learning to channel his emotional needs productively rather than destructively. Clementine didn't control Churchill by limiting his ambitions or tempering his personality. Instead, she controlled the environment that allowed his best qualities to flourish while managing his worst tendencies. She was his emotional regulator, helping him maintain perspective during both triumphs and disasters. The famous story of Churchill's response to criticism illustrates this perfectly. When political opponents attacked his wartime decisions, Churchill's instinct was to respond with devastating, rhetorical counterattacks. Clementine would counsel him to consider whether such responses served the war effort or merely his ego. More often than not, she convinced him to take the higher road, not by suppressing his nature, but by appealing to his higher purposes. This dynamic created what historians call Churchill's paradox, how a man known for his enormous ego became capable of subordinating that ego to larger causes when it truly mattered. The answer was Clementine's influence in helping him distinguish between validation and purpose, between being impressive and being effective. David began applying these insights to his own professional relationships. Instead of entering meetings focused on showcasing his expertise, he started focusing on understanding other people's challenges and finding ways to help solve them. Instead of competing for recognition, he began looking for ways to make his colleagues more successful. The transformation in how others responded to him was dramatic and almost immediate. When David stopped needing to be the smartest person in the room and started helping others feel smart, people began seeking his input and collaboration. When he focused on making others successful rather than proving his own worth, opportunities began appearing naturally. Churchill's wartime leadership revealed the full power of this transformation. His greatest speeches weren't exercises in rhetorical brilliance. They were emotional connections with a people facing their darkest hour. He had learned to channel his personal need for significance into collective inspiration and hope. "We shall never surrender" wasn't just political rhetoric, it was Churchill speaking from the deepest part of himself, the part that Clementine had helped him access and trust. His personal struggles with depression and self-doubt gave him authentic understanding of despair, while her love and guidance had taught him that despair could be overcome through purpose and connection. Have you ever noticed how your greatest personal struggles often become the source of your most meaningful contributions to others? The letters between Winston and Clementine during the war years reveal a partnership that functioned as a single, highly effective leadership unit. When Churchill was overwhelmed by military decisions, Clementine would remind him of the human cost of delay. When he was discouraged by political opposition, she would refocus his attention on historical significance rather than immediate popularity. This wasn't a traditional marriage where one partner sacrificed their identity for the other's success. Clementine maintained her own strong opinions, her own social causes, and her own political judgment. She influenced Churchill not by subordinating herself to him, but by being a worthy intellectual and emotional partner who could challenge him when necessary and support him when needed. David realized that his own relationship challenges stemmed from a similar misunderstanding. He had been looking for someone to validate his worth rather than someone to share authentic partnership with. Like Churchill, he needed to become the kind of person capable of genuine partnership before he could attract or maintain one. The genius key of Churchill's later career was how completely he integrated Clementine's influence into his decision-making process. He didn't just consult her on personal matters, he had internalized her perspective on what made leadership effective versus what merely fed his ego. This integration allowed him to maintain his powerful personality while channeling it toward genuinely constructive ends. Churchill's famous magnanimity toward defeated enemies, his ability to build coalitions with former opponents, his skill at inspiring hope rather than just defiance. All these mature leadership qualities developed through decades of Clementine's influence in helping him understand the difference between strength and dominance, between confidence and arrogance. The post-war years revealed the full extent of this transformation. Churchill could have spent his remaining years basking in historical glory and nursing grudges against those who had opposed him. Instead, he focused on warning about new threats from the Soviet Union, working to strengthen the Atlantic Alliance, and writing histories that emphasized collective achievement rather than personal vindication. This shift from self-centered to purpose-centered thinking made Churchill not just a wartime leader, but a statesman whose influence extended far beyond his own lifetime. Clementine's guidance had taught him that true legacy comes not from personal recognition, but from contributions that outlast the individual who makes them. David's own career began accelerating as he internalized these principles. Instead of fighting for credit, he started creating value. Instead of demanding recognition, he began earning respect. Instead of trying to impress superiors, he focused on serving colleagues and clients. The promotions and opportunities that had eluded him for years began appearing naturally as byproducts of his shift in focus. The marriage of Winston and Clementine Churchill lasted until his death in 1965, spanning some of the most tumultuous decades in human history. Through political failures and triumphs, personal struggles and public acclaim, financial difficulties and international recognition, their partnership remained the stable foundation that allowed Churchill to take enormous risks and weather devastating setbacks. What made this partnership so effective wasn't that Clementine controlled Churchill's weaknesses, it was that she helped him transform his weaknesses into strengths. His need for validation became sensitivity to public mood. His tendency toward self-absorption became deep empathy for others facing crisis. His grandiose ambitions became historic achievements that served humanity rather than just his ego. Churchill's hidden weakness, his desperate need for approval and validation, never disappeared. But under Clementine's influence, it evolved from a crippling vulnerability into a powerful tool for connection and leadership. He learned to seek validation through service rather than self-promotion, through contribution rather than competition, through legacy rather than immediate recognition. If this story resonates with your own struggles to balance ambition with authenticity, to find recognition while maintaining integrity, share it with someone who needs to understand that our greatest weaknesses can become our most powerful strengths. Subscribe to join a community committed to purposeful leadership rather than empty achievement. Like this video if you believe that the right partnerships can transform not just personal happiness, but professional effectiveness. David's transformation, from overlooked technician to respected leader, took time, but the principles he learned from studying Churchill's relationship with Clementine created lasting change. He stopped viewing his need for recognition as something to be satisfied and started seeing it as energy to be channeled toward meaningful contribution. The most profound insight from Churchill's story isn't that great men need great women behind them. It's that great achievements require the emotional intelligence to distinguish between ego and purpose, between validation and contribution, between being impressive and being influential. Churchill's greatest victories weren't military or political, they were personal. He learned to transform his neediness into service, his insecurity into empathy, his grandiosity into genuine greatness. This transformation was only possible because Clementine provided the emotional safety and intellectual challenge that allowed him to grow beyond his limitations. Your own professional and personal struggles may feel unique, but they often reflect the same fundamental challenge that Churchill faced: learning to channel personal needs into purposeful action, to seek fulfillment through contribution rather than recognition, to build influence through service rather than self-promotion. The weakness that Churchill thought would destroy him, his desperate need for validation, became the very quality that made him capable of inspiring others during their darkest hours. His personal familiarity with doubt and insecurity gave him authentic understanding of what people needed to hear when facing seemingly impossible challenges. Churchill's legacy reminds us that our greatest vulnerabilities, when properly understood and channeled, often become our most powerful strengths. The man who nearly destroyed his career through desperate attention-seeking became history's most inspiring wartime leader because he learned to seek attention for causes larger than himself. The partnership between Winston and Clementine, Churchill demonstrates that true influence comes not from hiding our weaknesses, but from transforming them into wisdom, not from avoiding our needs, but from channeling them towards service, not from pretending to be invulnerable, but from finding the courage to be authentically strong. David's story, like Churchill's, represents the possibility available to anyone willing to make the difficult transition from seeking validation to offering value, from demanding recognition to earning respect, from trying to impress others to focusing on serving them. The transformation requires courage, patience, and often the guidance of someone who can see our potential more clearly than we can see it ourselves. The hidden weakness that nearly ended Churchill's career became the foundation of his greatest achievements because he learned to harness it for purposes larger than personal gratification. Your own struggles with recognition, validation, and authentic influence represent similar opportunities for transformation if you're willing to channel them towards service rather than self-satisfaction.